the best of the week on Relevant Radio.
Well, here to fill us in on the CLT, maybe expose you to something that could change your kid's future or yours, is Jeremy Tate. He's the founder of Classic Learning, the Classic Learning Test, and check him out at cltexam.com if you want more details on this. Jeremy, thanks for joining us. Can't wait to talk to you about this one.
Hey, Drew, thanks for the invite. Glad to be here.
I want to start with the history. I mean, when I started to read about this, I thought, oh, my gosh, this is a brilliant idea, especially if universities would accept it, to have students coming in, like, with a different set of, foundational principles. But what happened? I mean, how did this gain traction? What was the impetus behind this? How did you get involved? Fill us in.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's funny, standardized testing, at first, it can seem to some people like the boringest topic under the sun, and sometimes people will joke, the only thing more boring than a standardized test is hearing somebody talk about a standardized test. But it's a fascinating conversation because standardized testing is actually what drives and shapes curriculum, right? Teachers inevitably teach towards the test. And so the CLT launched in 2015, and at that time, the SAT and ACT had aligned with the Common Core standards. And the Common Core was very unpopular with homeschoolers, Christian school students, a lot of just conservative public school students. They saw what this was, right? That this was anti-Western, anti-fiction, anti-classics, anti-Christian, and just weird on the math side, right? And so a lot of the best schools in the country rejected Common Core, but really out of a play for market share, SAT and ACT both aligned to want to be the definitive, college entrance exam in America. But that created a demand for a third option. And so we launched that with this conviction that the test is going to shape the curriculum. And so what should students be, what should education look like in high school? Well, it's our conviction that it should look like it always looked until about 100 years ago, and that education in the West was always about cultural transmission, a deep dive, the transmission of the Western intellectual tradition, and also moral formation, the cultivation of virtue, right? And that was the purpose of education for millennia until really the early 1900s, when you had really, really radical progressives essentially hijack education, and it became about basically what's useful. This was this whole pragmatic movement in education that said, if a student's not going to use it, they shouldn't have to learn it, right? But if you have that mentality, you end up getting rid of philosophy, you end up getting rid of poetry, you end up getting rid of classical literature, Latin, Greek. All of the things that have defined Western civilization are eliminated with that pragmatic approach. And so really, the heart and soul of education is about cultural transmission, and that's what we want to get back to by offering a test, a new standard that is rooted in this tradition.
What about the critics who probably are saying, oh, this is a conservative thing, right? It's a conservative alternative. It's not as rigorous as the ACT or the SAT. How do you respond to somebody who says that this is appealing because you're either conservative or you're religious? Because it emphasizes classical texts and traditional values.
Yeah. We say two things. We never say, hey, we're a conservative alternative to the SAT, but we are an alternative rooted in the Western intellectual tradition. Yep. And we don't censor texts because they're by Christian authors. We actually did an audit on the SAT. We discovered that they were using close to 0% Christian source material. In other words, they're just acting like the Christian intellectual tradition, the tradition that built the West, doesn't exist. And so they're giving kids, I'm not talking about belief, but they're giving kids a distorted view of history, of reality, of the cultural force that really shaped our country. And so we're trying to be honest to the tradition that we've inherited. The other thing is, any student will say this, out of the three options, the CLT is objectively the most rigorous. Right now, the SAT and ACT are so watered down. The longest reading passage on the SAT now, 25 words. The longest is 120 words. This is like the length of a tweet. And so really, these companies have competed against each other by watering down the test over time to become the easier test. Because if you're the easier test, then you're the easier pathway to admissions and scholarship. So CLT launched to kind of hit the reset button and said, no, it's time to have a new gold standard. And in fact, Secretary Hegseth That's exactly what he called CLT when the service academies adopted West Point Air Force Naval Academy. They're not just adopting, but CLT is going to be our new gold standard at the academies.
Wow. It's interesting you say that the test has been kind of watered down. This is my understanding. I mean, you can correct me if I'm off on this, but for decades, these standardized tests, my understanding, they've followed the drift of public education, and of course, they've removed references to faith. They've minimized moral clarity. They've replaced great books with this so-called more inclusive literature that sometimes includes these radical ideologies. And
100%.
Our kids are the ones that lose because when you take away, I really believe this. When you take away the moral compass and the intellectual richness of Western civilization, what do you get? You get a generation adrift. And, if we need to go back and form the soul, right? And if we do that, then students are not going to be measured just by the technical skills, but by their grasp of the truth and beauty and goodness. And I don't know, there's something profoundly Catholic about that, if you ask me.
Yeah, 100%. And it's humanizing to students. When students are taught that, if you go into almost any public school classroom and you ask the students, so what are we doing here? What's the purpose of school? Almost every student will tell you it's to get a better job, right? That is dehumanizing. Mm-hmm. Nobody from 200 years ago would have said the purpose of education is to get a better job, right? It was always about growing in wisdom, right, growing in virtue. And we've replaced it. And, I love the C.S. Lewis quote. C.S. Lewis says that when education is beaten by jobs training, that civilization dies. So the stakes are very, very high. And there's a tremendous, and you alluded to this in your introduction, I think CLT is part of a cultural movement. I mean, look at this. Yeah. Gen Z, they're leading in church attendance right now. Gen Z is the youngest, right? There is a deep hunger for tradition, anchoredness, rootedness, stability. And I think they're finding that in this tradition that they were denied.
Yeah. I sit here and I'm talking with you, and I've often wondered, when did colleges get so upside down? When did the very institution that once, to your point, pushed you to stretch, right, to strive, to rise above your limits, to be well-formed, become places where nearly half of the students are seeking shelter and are coming out, malformed. I saw this stat, and I'd love you to talk a little bit about this as well. And let me open the phone. So if you are in academia, if you've taken these tests, if you just want to sound off, if you've got a perspective or a question, feel free to join me and Jeremy here. Jeremy Tate is joining me, the founder of this new test. The number to get in is 888-914-9149. 888-914-9149. I was reading a piece that says, America now says a college is not worth the cost anymore. And I think a lot of people also think that. They take a look at, they got their art history degree or whatever it is that the degree is, and they come out and they're like, I can't use this, right? They've got debt, they've got all these other problems. And, even other students who have more legitimate degrees are finding it. I shouldn't say that. Forgive me. I want to take that back. My sister has an art history degree. I don't want to undermine the degree. I'm just saying some of the degrees that people have, they're not finding work in. And, the question is college even worth it anymore? There's this movement towards a lot of blue collar jobs. I'd love to get your take on that and what's happened with college, because college has become so high. And a lot of people, they've got their 4-year degree because you're supposed to make $1 million more over the life of your over your lifetime if you have one of these degrees, and yet they can't find work. How do you address that particular issue there, where people say college isn't even worth it anymore? And I know you said it's not about going to make more money, but that's one of the reasons why people go.
Yeah, it's such a great question, right? And and so I think that if the goal of going to college is, and this is, I'm so happy Michael Knowles has said this and stuck to this publicly. But if the goal of going to college is to get a better job, I don't know that you should go to college, right? Yeah. I think if the goal of going to college is to, explore the deep questions in life, or if you're going for something, if you're looking to pursue law or nursing or something that needs, a college degree, then absolutely. But I think we've got to get away. And it's crazy the degree to which I think a lot of even conservatives have kind of bought into this kind of pragmatic vision, for education. I think a lot of young people are right saying, I don't need college. I think Charlie Kirk was right?
Yeah.
to get a job. But you look at the way a place like Hillsdale or the University of Dallas, Cedarville, you meet some of their graduates. And I think there's a paradox here because they got this education at Hillsdale not to become employable, but because of the way they were shaped, they are like the most employable people ever.
That's wild. That's so true. And it's such a really, really good point. Something else we're seeing too is, and the numbers were staggering. I'll share a few of these. 38% of undergraduates at Stanford, right? It's a very prestigious institution, are now registered as having a disability. At Harvard and Brown, more than 20%, and at Amherst, more than 30%. That's a new norm that they're seeing. And I was reading this piece that highlighted the explosion of students getting extra time on tests, flexible deadlines, private dorm rooms. And they said the reason for this is the skyrocketing diagnosis of ADHD. You know, people are saying, hey, they're having trouble focusing, they have anxiety, they have depression. So you say that, and next thing you know, they have these accommodations. But the question, and you're the educator here, I want to get your take on this, is that, and I don't want to undermine anything, I mean, is this really about disabilities, people who legitimately need time, or is it about, working the system, taking advantage? Because, if you're able to manipulate this, get a little more time, then you got an edge, and that becomes a commodity. It becomes an opportunity and a strategy. So I just am curious as to what you see with this trend. I mean, when you're looking at almost 40% of college students now having disabilities, it makes me question the numbers. Yeah,
100%. And the reality is that it's both. And is there abuse? There's a lot of abuse. There are students also that have, in CLT we offer accommodations, and some of those, of course, are undeniably real. So we students even with vision impairments and that sort of thing. Right. But I've got a daughter who's a sophomore in college now, and her whole friend group. I was talking to her whole friend group. They got over a dozen girls, and it was kind of a joke. I mean, the girls would actually talk of, if you were going to go and get yourself an accommodation, because that would allow you to have more time. And of course, you're going to get a higher score on the SAT if you've got more time than less time. So it is being abused, I think, in a big way right now. And it's tough, because we want to meet the needs of students that have legitimate needs and need certain accommodations. But the abuse is widespread.
We'll go to the phones, take a few calls here. Before I do that, though, speaking of timing on tests, the CLT you say is a little bit more difficult. Does it take more time to do a CLT versus an SAT or an ACT?
It's actually a little bit shorter. It used to be a lot shorter. So the CLT has always been 120 questions, 120 minutes. The SAT, the new SAT now is just about 2 hours and 20 minutes. So we're a little bit shorter, actually.
Wow, interesting.